So Inside Out is a thing, and its sequel just came out, so yeah, sure, I'll shamelessly hop on a trend if it'll help out the channel. But chances are, if you grew up around the 2010s, or if you had children growing up around the 2010s, or let's face it, if you have feelings at all, then you know about the original movie. It sits in a very special place in a lot of people's hearts. I think most people, including myself, were a little hesitant when a sequel was announced, as the first movie was such a unique and insightful look into the way the emotions function, and was only made more powerful because of its honest exploration into the mind of a young girl. I remember when the first movie was released in 2015. I had just finished my undergrad and was trying to figure out how to adult properly, so I found a movie exploring the idea of sadness and frustration particularly poignant as I was dealing with a lot of those feelings. Despite Riley being a young girl, the emotional turmoil in her brain was one that I saw as a reflection of myself on the big screen. If you've seen any of my other Disney or Pixar videos, then you know that I view Disney as a bit of an arch nemesis. But I will admit that when they get a movie right, they really get it right. And this movie has all of that Pixar magic. It's hilarious and seriously insightful in one go. I didn't catch the first movie in theaters, but watched it by myself at home later. That was probably for the best because I definitely bawled. I don't care who you are, this scene when Riley comes home and cries to her parents is incredibly moving. It also dug up some weird memories of this Canadian show called Mental Block about this teenager with kids inside his brain controlling him.
Whatever, shut it down. We'll see you later, dude. This is later, dude.
Canadian television is fucking weird. I really enjoyed this movie, so when a sequel was announced, I wasn't super excited to see the legacy of the first movie get ruined because I do not trust Disney. Certainly the end had called for the possibility of a sequel, but I chose to think of the allusion to puberty as a joke rather than foreshadowing. That joke doesn't really land as powerfully when you know there's another movie on that exact topic coming. But like the terrible practices of Disney itself, a sequel was inevitable, and so just a few weeks ago in the year 2024, Inside Out 2 was released, and I rewatched the first one in preparation, and then went into the second with cautious optimism. Don't get me wrong, I did not support Disney with money. They know what they're doing! Immediately, I was drawn back into the world that I had left 9 years ago. I was invested, and the characters and story were just as clever, funny, and, well, emotional. Not only was the research still very much a backdrop that informed the world of Riley's mind, but the brand new story was once again a powerful reflection of growing up. I liked the sequel a lot, and if Disney has their way and wants to do a third one, I'd be okay with that, if they can keep the quality in writing up. And if they could tone down their exploitation of workers. But beyond Disney's evil business practices, the sequel managed to capture the magic of the first movie and was just as satisfying to watch and matches the wonder of the original. And this is important because even though we are experiencing different parts of Riley's life, it's still one person and progression of the same characters is important. But for these two movies, it goes a step further because the way the characters react is important for how emotions are portrayed narratively, how they reflect reality in terms of how they're supposed to function, and how these two things taught a whole generation of children, and probably adults, about their emotions. And so today, I want to talk about Inside Out. Longtime Pixar writer, director, and all-around amazing dude, Peter Docter had just finished and released the incredibly successful Up, adding its success to his other masterwork, Monsters, Inc. as a director, and to a far longer list of Pixar movies that he also had a hand in creating, like Toy Story and WALL-E, both of which I have videos for and will shamelessly plug. After any large project, Docter did what anybody does and took a break. Anyone who's creative knows that inspiration can come from anywhere at any time. And for Docter, it was his daughter's turn towards the taciturn that sparked his interest in what was going on in her mind and what was causing such a shift from a happy young child to a serious young woman. Other than puberty, I mean.
Guys, what's puberty? I don't know. It's probably not important.
Docter began workshopping this idea with other members of the Pixar creative team, but in particular, Ronnie Del Carmen, whom Docter had worked with on Finding Nemo and Up, and who would become co-director for this new project. I'm also going to assume that Docter did his best as a parent for his daughter and didn't just take the inspiration and run. After the initial pitch was greenlit, Docter headed up a small team which began creating the story and sketching the look of the movie. Riley was initially thought of as the main character, but it became clear that the emotions inside Riley's head were the key to the story, and so Riley became a side character and the setting, strangely enough. The decision to move into Riley's head pushed Docter to include more females, like Meg LaFauve, into the writing and creative process in order to allow their contributions and insight into the female experience. The other group who was consulted throughout the writing and pre-production process were neuroscientists and behavioral psychologists. Paul Ekman and Dasher Keltner are two leading experts who were consulted on the film. Both have and continue to do extensive and groundbreaking research into the psychology of emotions. Based on their research, they gave Doctor and his team 27 unique emotions that could be explored. Of course, 27 is far too many characters, and so with Ekman and Keltner's help, Doctor pared down those to a smaller number, eventually landing on 5 characters to fill Riley's head. The unique look of Riley's mind required not just a different art direction, but a different perspective on animation. The emotions themselves were carefully designed in order to convey exactly what their personalities were meant to be and do. The emotions were also animated not as solid entities, but groupings of particles, which served to further differentiate them from the human world, but also allowed them to be squishier, bouncier, and more cartoony and animated. Because of these very bizarre animation choices, Inside Out is still considered to have one of the longest and most arduous animated processes of all time. In 2015, Inside Out was released and became a fan favorite, cementing itself as another Pixar masterpiece. The list of awards and nominations for this movie has its own Wikipedia page, which speaks to the volume more than anything, but it is impressive. With the movie out, Doctor was ready to move on to other projects like Soul, which I also have a video on, but he hadn't forgotten about those other 22 emotions that were proposed. After Soul, Doctor found himself as the creative officer and head of Pixar Animation, meaning he didn't have a lot of time for movie making, but that didn't stop the idea of a sequel from sticking with the Pixar team. Kelsey Mann, who joined Pixar for Monsters University, was chosen as director, and Meg LaFauve returned to write the script. The initial idea was to introduce more emotions into Riley's mind, and eventually 4 new emotions were chosen to keep the story nice and simple, plus a cameo from Nostalgia.
Remember when we all finally came up to headquarters?
That was like 30 seconds ago, Nostalgia.
Unfortunately, Bill Hader and Mindy Kaling opted not to return as Fear and Disgust respectively due to what has been reported as a dispute over pay, which doesn't surprise me. Disney sucks. The second movie has only just come out a few weeks ago as I write this, and as much as I would love for Disney to suffer, the reception has been great and it is rightly deserved. In case you haven't seen Inside Out, or more likely that you haven't had a chance to see Inside Out 2, this is your spoiler warning. Inside Out begins with Joy stepping into existence when Riley was born. She explains who Riley is and how her personality is shaped by these personality islands, which are informed by core memories that Joy is very happy to say are all joyful. We also see each of the other 4 emotions come into being and help shape Riley. Having seen Riley through to 11 years old, Joy is confident in her ability to help Riley have the best, most happy-filled life she can. The only thorn in her plan is that sadness is there, generally wasting time and taking up space.
I'm awful.
No, you're not.
And annoying.
When Riley's father gets a new job, she, her mother, and her father are forced to move to San Francisco. On the day of the move, one bad thing after another seems to happen to Riley, but Joy makes the most of it and tries to keep the other emotions in check. However, Riley does not have a spectacular day. This only makes Joy more determined to give Riley the best first day at school. But when introducing herself, Riley begins to cry as she recalls a story of her old home. Sadness is touching this recalled memory, causing this to occur, and when this memory is reloaded back into Riley's brain, it moves to become a core memory. Not wanting Riley to have a core memory built on sadness, Joy intervenes, knocking all of the core memories, herself, and sadness into a tube to long-term memory. The result is that Riley stops feeling connected to her identity. While Joy and Sadness try to find a way back to the control room, Fear, Anger, and Disgust attempt to deal with the changes to Riley's life on their own, with disastrous results.
That's it! No, freeze! Find your happy place.
Without Joy or her core memories, Riley begins to make decisions that are contrary to her character, playing hockey out of anger and of course feeling no connection to her family or sense of humor. Meanwhile, Joy and Sadness meet Riley's childhood imaginary friend Bing Bong, who tells them about the train of thought which can take them back to the control room, but when Riley goes to sleep, the train of thought shuts down. The trio then head to Dream Productions and attempt to wake Riley up with a nightmare, which doesn't work until Sadness uses a clown from Riley's subconscious. Now that Riley is awake again, Joy, Sadness, and Bing Bong hop back on the train towards the control room. Having been woken up early, Disgust, Anger, and Fear are frustrated, and Anger comes up with the idea that if they don't have any good memories or feelings or connections to San Francisco, then they simply will have to return to the last place that they did feel good, and Riley decides to run away back to Minnesota. When Riley steals and lies in order to get money for a bus ticket home, Honesty Island starts to break apart, sending the train of thought spiraling, and Joy and Sadness fall back into long-term memory. When they stumble across a recall tube, Joy goes through it but leaves Sadness behind because she doesn't want Sadness to contaminate the core memories. But when Honesty Island fully sinks, it causes Joy and Bing Bong to be stuck in the forgotten memories. Joy is at a loss for what to do and spends a moment crying because she's upset. It is only then that she realizes that sadness is important too. Determined not to be forgotten, they find Bing Bong's imaginary rocket and the pair begin their escape attempt, but Bing Bong notices that he is weighing the rocket down and stays behind so Joy can make the jump, and he is forgotten, which causes Joy to feel sadness again over the loss of her friend. As Riley makes her way to the bus stop to run away, anger, fear, and disgust tried to abort as the idea has now become overwhelming and scary and generally is not good, but the control panel is non-responsive and begins to turn black. Joy and Sadness use bits of Riley's imagination and make it back to the control panel in the nick of time, and Sadness manages to pull out the idea and return feeling to the control panel. Riley gets off the bus and returns to her parents, and with the help of Sadness is able to express the fact that she is hurting over this move, and that her once happy memories have turned sad because they are a place and time that she knows she cannot go back to. Riley's mother and father comfort her, which creates a new core memory consisting of both sadness and joy, and this creates a stronger family island. We then see how Riley is growing and her interests are expanding as she continues to play hockey and grow in her new home with her parents. Inside Out 2 opens 2 years later as Riley and her friends, Grace and Bree, finish off their school year and hockey championship. After winning the game, the three friends are given an invitation to a high school level hockey skills camp over the summer. The night before Riley leaves for the skills camp, the puberty alarm in Riley's head goes off and she begins experiencing new emotions.
I'm too gross to go to camp or anywhere ever again!
Oh yeah, this is totally broken.
Joy, sadness, anger, fear, and disgust are now joined by anxiety, envy, embarrassment, and ennui. To make matters even more strange, Riley has found out that Grace and Bree will not be attending the same school as her.
Wait, aren't those traitors dead to us?
Now she's worried about being alone at her new school, impressing the coach, and possibly her new teammates, which includes her role model, Val Ortiz.
Look at her hair!
However, anxiety seems to see into the future in a way that Joy cannot, and her planning is really helpful in making Riley look good with the older girls. But the way that anxiety wants Riley to act goes against what Riley believes and her sense of self. So anxiety opts to create a new, better sense of self by replacing Riley's beliefs. She then sends the old sense of self back to the recesses of Riley's brain along with Joy's sadness, anger, fear, and disgust, who must now travel to retrieve the sense of self and put it back. In the control room, anxiety starts pushing Riley hard to get better in order to make the new team and have friends next year. Riley also begins acting in a different manner in order to appear cool to her teammates. Eventually, Riley becomes so caught up with making the team and anxiety so obsessed with knowing the future that she opts to have Riley steal the coach's notebook and see what the coach has decided, which is that Riley is not ready yet. This sends anxiety into a flurry and she creates a brainstorm of ideas in order to try to do something big and drastic to show that she is ready. The idea is that Riley should dye her hair red like her new friends to try and match them, and that she should score 3 goals in order to outdo the record that Val created. But this only causes Riley to create a new anxious and self-deprecating sense of self.
I'm not good enough.
In order to get back to headquarters, Joy decides that they're going to have to let all the memories they had repressed back into Riley's subconsciousness and ride the wave to headquarters. In her pursuit of perfection, Riley winds up hurting Grace. This causes her to get placed in the penalty box, where anxiety can't figure out what is going wrong and begins to go into overdrive, causing Riley to spiral. Joy manages to talk to anxiety, but realizes that Riley needs to see herself for who she really is, both good and bad, and that all her memories create a version of Riley that is honest with herself. Riley begins to relax as she sees herself clearly, and she apologizes to Grace and Bree, who forgive her, and Riley chooses to play hockey for the fun of the game. Ooh, nice crossover. What? I might not get sports, but I'm still Canadian. We then see Riley, who has now started high school, hanging out with her new friends. She is anxiously awaiting for the coach to announce the new team roster and if she will be on it, but is safe in the knowledge that she has new and old friends and that there will always be next year if she doesn't make it this time. And that is where the story has ended so far, but there are still 18 more emotions to go. 17 if we count nostalgia.
You still have about 10 years, 2 graduations, and a best friend's wedding before you're invited, but I will keep you in the loop, I promise.
My biggest complaint about both movies is that the story inside Riley's head is usually about the characters traveling to a place and an event stopping them from that goal, just so that they can have a pit stop in a part of Riley's mind and explain what it does before coming up with a new way to travel, and then the cycle repeats.
That's a sarcasm! It can open for miles! Run for your lives!
Like, I know that's clever and it sets up a really funny gag, but it does feel a bit contrived just for the narrative. In the first movie, this is largely because there is no villain. Villains are a great way to tell stories about morality for children or about conflicting ideology for more complicated stories, and they highlight the themes and goals of characters very obviously. Writing a story without a villain is difficult because you lose the benefit of an opposing force and source of conflict for the main character. The decision to have no villain in the first Inside Out movie is important because it reflects how conflict in the real world is more often about circumstance and internal strife rather than external conflict. For a movie about the inside of a young girl's mind, this is important. That isn't to say there isn't conflict. Riley moving to San Francisco and all of the smaller issues that come with that, such as starting a new school, are real-world conflicts that she must learn to overcome. It is the same conflicts that Joy deals with inside Riley's mind. This double storytelling thing is actually really great because conflicts are dealt with by both characters inside and outside Riley's mind, and their reactions influence each other's stories. For Joy, the move is an annoyance, but nothing she can't overcome. Instead, it is sadness that gets in Joy's way, and the move is only an inciting event. It is sadness's tampering with the core memories, which launches her and Joy to long-term memory, leaving fear, anger, and disgust to deal with the control room. It appears that sadness was the one who messed everything up, implying that she is perhaps not the villain but the antagonist. This is certainly how sadness is set up at the beginning of the movie, but it's important to note that the beginning narration and our primary character have been Joy thus far, and it is abundantly clear that Joy is not impartial at all, nor does she understand sadness.
And I've checked, there's no place for her to go, so she's good. We're good. It's all great.
That is because Joy is both the protagonist and the antagonist of this movie. Not the villain, because she's not morally or ideologically set apart from the hero, but she is the primary cause of her own conflict. Eventually, she does learn to get out of her own way and realize that sadness is just as important as all the other emotions. And just as Riley's conflict was reflected inside of her mind, Joy's conflict is reflected in Riley, who has this internal journey and realization that she cannot run away from her problems. Riley makes the choice to face her problems and realizes that she has not been honest with herself, and it's okay to let yourself be sad. The second movie is a bit more straightforward, but I'll still argue that there's no villain in the traditional sense. Anxiety is not ideologically opposed, but simply misguided. In this case, the central conflict revolves around Riley's sense of self, and because of anxiety, she begins to lose that and become filled with self-doubt. This is not anxiety's intention at all, and she learns that catastrophizing will lead Riley to constantly worry about her life and become too hard on herself. Anxiety, Joy, and Riley all have to learn lessons in this movie. But I do like the scene where Riley takes a minute to cry after learning that her friends will not be going to high school with her. This, to me, is a beautiful moment that showed that Riley and Joy have both learned their lesson from the first movie. Sadness is an important emotion.
It's okay. We need this.
In the end, Joy comes to realize that Riley's childhood sense of self is not strong enough to deal with the conflicts and new emotions that are plaguing her teenage life. She also learns that she cannot pick and choose what memories make up Riley's sense of self, which is what Joy was actually doing at the beginning of the movie as well. Anxiety is a much more complex emotion, which I think is clear in the conflict. She cares for Riley's well-being, possibly more than any of the other emotions, and she is efficient and productive, but can also be too controlling. Like all emotions, she is both good and bad. In order to combat this, at the end, we see her learn that she cannot control everything and must learn to let some things go. When Riley apologizes to her friends and is forgiven, she embraces a view of herself that is much more honest instead of only seeing the good. She sees herself as real and flawed, but capable of learning and growing. At the end, we also see Riley is multifaceted in her interests and abilities too.
She can be bored, but never boring.
That is really powerful, and while I think the first movie was more novel and exciting, I preferred the second movie because the sense of self introduced gives Riley a lot more autonomy as a character and reflects the way that emotions influence us but do not control our way of thinking. Emotions still color her experience, pun intended, but Riley makes her own decisions now because she's much more multidimensional. In the second movie, the conflict in her head is permeated by this sentiment.
We don't get to choose who Riley is.
But nowhere is Riley's autonomy more impactful than during the final hockey scene, because Riley's console reaches out for Joy. This is Riley making a conscious decision to play hockey for fun. Not aggressively, not for social reasons, not for the future, but simply because she wants to have fun with her friends and play the game she loves. The cinematography reflects this too. During the final conflict, the camera is focused on Riley's face and body language, which tells us, the audience, how she's feeling like the world has faded away and that the only thing that remains is dread. In order to combat this, Riley begins to ground herself in the real world outside of her mind by engaging with her senses. We see how she touches the textured wood of the bench, watches the light outside the window, listens to the sounds of the rink and people playing hockey, feels the chill in the air on her face and in her lungs. The point is that Riley uses her senses to become aware of her surroundings and experience hockey simply because she loves the game, and this is what calls joy to the console. I want to be clear that I do not think that this is a case of just choosing to be happy in order to get rid of anxiety or depression. I think the first movie taught us that this isn't how that works at all. It is once Riley is past her anxiety that she makes a conscious effort to call forth joy for the end of the match. This right here is why I love the second movie so much, because not only is it a great character moment and resolution, it is also a reflection of actual brain function. One of my favorite aspects of the movies is figuring out why different emotions act in specific ways and what function they have. After all, if evolution retains attributes because they are beneficial, then there must be a reason for emotions to stick around. That is to say, they must be beneficial to Riley in some capacity. Joy is fairly clear, as she is the state of emotion that occurs when something Riley likes happens. Joy comes in levels of intensity, but in the first movie it's clear that most of Riley's life is filled with happiness, and these less intense states of happiness tell our brain that there are no pressing needs the body requires socially or mentally. Fear is pretty obvious.
He's really good at keeping Riley safe.
Very useful for assessing the physical environment. Disgust keeps Riley safe in a different way, by avoiding potentially dangerous foods like the very bitter broccoli, which the brain thinks might be poison. But disgust also works socially by keeping Riley's reputation in check.
From Michigan, right?
It's Minnesota, sweetie.
No, we cannot correct Val Ortiz.
Anger gets a bit of a bad reputation. It is out of anger that Riley comes to the idea to run away, and it blinds her from making good choices.
I have access to the entire curse word library.
But it is also the emotion of action. On a broader level, anger is the emotion that we feel when injustice or wrongs are committed to or around us. This is important because anger can be destructive, as we often hear self-help hacks preach, but it is the emotion that elicits action and change, either externally when we speak out in anger against things we deem unfair, or sometimes internally when we get frustrated with our own behavior and ask ourselves to change, the latter being the far harder to admit and achieve. This idea of destructive or negative emotions is one that really irritates me, because evolutionarily we would not have these emotions if they were not useful. And this is the main point of the first movie. Sadness is perceived as this negative and useless emotion, and happiness as this great and positive force. But we see through the course of that first film that joy is pushed and pushed as the most important emotion by both Joy herself and her mother.
If you and I can keep smiling, it would be a big help. We can do that for him, right?
The result is that Riley feels she must maintain happiness. How many of you have heard from a parent or older adult that you used to be such a happy child, and what happened to you? As though feeling other emotions is bad. Joy can be just as destructive as anger, and it's actually what causes the conflict in the first movie, as I said. On the other side, we have sadness, often seen as useless and blubbering, which we get some good gags out of.
Crying helps me slow down and obsess over the weight of life's problems.
But sadness is also an emotion of expressing hurt and healing. In the second movie, we get the scene where Riley lets herself cry, but only when she deems it socially safe enough to do so. This lets her heal and process what's going on.
Yeah, no big deal.
This is
Are you serious right now?
Sadness is also an emotion of connection and empathy. When Bing Bong is sad, sadness forges a connection. When Riley needs her parents to understand her pain, she cries to them. Sadness is a call for support. I think that showing this kind of realization and emotionality for a young boy instead of Riley would have been huge, as men are still discouraged from feeling sadness, and often joy as well. And I also think it's worth noting which emotions present as masculine versus feminine, but I love the way this movie explores the mind of a young female as opposed to a male, and the female representation that this leads to. There are only 4 male-presenting characters in the entire second movie. Speaking of the second film, the emotions in that movie are also created to act in particular ways. Envy as an emotion can be negative, as we all realize the things that others have and become jealous, but envy is also a useful tool for noticing how others perform and pinpointing our own lack of skill and ability in those areas, allowing for improvement.
We followed our new varsity caliber training program. Oh, I wish I thought of that. Newsflash, you did!
Embarrassment is a neat one. It's pretty clear what embarrassment does in the moment, but it's more complicated than just blushing. Embarrassment is about dealing with social situations and social mores. When we have done something out of place or draw attention to ourselves in a way that breaks social norms, we feel embarrassment as a way of regulating our future interactions. But it is also preventative. I think it's worth noting that when Sadness is in headquarters, it is embarrassment that helps her because he understands the social implications that anxiety's over-the-top actions will lead to. And indeed, when Riley dyes her hair out of desperation, it comes across as embarrassing even for us to watch. Cringe, as the kids say. Ennui is a bit of an enigma. She is
what you would call the boredom.
But it's more than just simply being bored. It is about dissatisfaction with life. You feel ennui when there are parts of your life that lack fulfillment and meaning. I would have liked to have seen more done with ennui in this respect, and perhaps as Riley develops as a teen, she will feel this emotion more acutely. It reminds me a bit of how we feel alienation, which you can hear me talk more about on this video on the movie Office Space. Perhaps we do not get to see much of ennui because the second movie is so focused on anxiety. Anxiety is seen as a negative emotion, and we see the results of letting it run wild, not just in the climax, but also in the way it takes over Imagination Land and turns it into a totalitarian animation studio meant for churning out possible future scenarios no matter how likely they are. Also, is this a cry for help from the animators? Are you okay? Do you need help? I mean, we all know Disney is the worst. Before anxiety takes over and becomes negative, we do see how effective she is. Anxiety plans for the future, and a certain amount of anxiety can be healthy as it can motivate action in order to avoid bad results, and can provide a kick in the pants in order to achieve goals.
We can't control whether Riley makes the team, but what can we control? Well, Riley has a Spanish test tomorrow. We need to study.
But what is nice about both movies is that despite the arguments that the emotions all have, and will doubtlessly continue to have, at the end of both movies, they're all able to get along and work together. This is not just a nice sentiment, but an understanding that in order to find inner peace, all emotions are important, and balance between them keeps each of them from becoming destructive as they keep each other in check. Sometimes that balance means actively practicing what emotion to feel through things like cognitive behavior therapy. But the fact that the emotions in the movie reflect how they actually function in the brain is a very important aspect of this movie, and has a huge impact in offering audiences powerful insight into our own emotions and thought processes. It's pretty clear that, like most Pixar movies, both Inside Outs are meant for and aimed at children. While there are definitely moments and jokes for the adults,
there are no bears in San Francisco.
I saw a really hairy guy. He looked like a bear.
The story of both movies explores the mind of a young girl who becomes a young preteen, and the conflicts are set up in a way that is easy for younger audiences to understand. But this movie has had a lasting impact on its audience that is slightly different than most movies, and particularly poignant for children. Most movies aim to have a kind of impact on audiences through unique story or artistic experience. With children, it is often moral or inspirational messages, and that's in these movies as Riley learns the importance of sadness and how all emotions are important in moderation, but become overwhelming or destructive in excess. You know, all the garbage I was just saying in the last section. But there is another effect that Inside Out has had, and that is the way that it teaches children to understand emotion. When I was talking about negative versus positive emotions, I spoke about the way that young men are taught to ignore certain feelings and are taught not to cry. I think that is the same for women, but with other emotions, but as a male, this is the one I've come across the most. Because for some reason, this is the way we have actually taught children to deal with their emotions.
We are suppressed emotions!
But as I said before, all emotions have a necessary and important role to play that's been developed through evolution and social interaction. As a society and as parents, or just adults in general, we try to direct children towards what we think is right for them and how they ought to act, particularly when it comes to emotional expression and gender roles. But children are a minority, brought up in a world of adults, and are relatively powerless. Very rarely are they given the ability to advocate for themselves, and so they are forced to navigate a world that is far more complex than they are ready for, and in general does not cater to their needs. This is the same for emotional needs too. Adults know best, and so children are taught which emotions are okay to express, and which emotions to withhold or ignore. But if you're paying attention, you'll notice two things wrong with this. The first should make you angry, because there is an injustice at hand. Children are not given the right to express their autonomy and stand up for their own well-being. That's not okay. The second one is more about logical conclusions, because what happens when these children grow up? They become adults. Adults that are expected to have a command over their emotions, but because they were not allowed to or not taught to as children, they have very little skill in this department. It is true that emotions can be complex, and they only grow to be more so as we grow up. And we see this with Riley's memories becoming mixed with various emotions at the end of the first movie, and her new emotions being more complex in the sequel. Not to mention the fact that there are just more of them in there now. We also see Riley's sense of self become more complex at the end of the second movie. When emotions are ignored or labeled incorrectly as destructive or more valuable than others by adults, children are negatively affected because they are not learning how to express what experience is currently happening to them. And this is where the Inside Out movies are real game changers, because they provide children with hermeneutical resources. Oh, that's a big one. A hermeneutical resource is basically a word that is used to describe a particular personal experience. Throughout both movies, we see how Riley is affected by the emotions inside her mind. Not only does this affect the narrative inside and outside of Riley's head, but the emotions also act in a way that helps explain why Riley behaves or feels a certain way. So when Riley cries because she is hurt that her friends will not attend high school with her, we watch as sadness touches the control panel. Children can then see themselves reflected in this character on screen because children are incredibly empathetic, and now they can see that the character, called Sadness, is helping Riley feel this way. Now they have a word to describe the experience. They have a hermeneutical resource called sadness. Every scene in these movies is basically another example of how emotions make us think or act in certain ways. And because they're all based on neuroscience, the resources that children get when they watch are accurate to what we understand about the mind and ourselves. Within reason. Neuroscience is ongoing and we're constantly discovering new things. But the movie doesn't just have to give words to explain a feeling. Never in the second movie does the word panic attack get uttered, and yet Riley's body language and anxiety's mind tornado thing at the control panel are visual indicators. Because movies are a visual medium, they can convey ideas visually, and thus we can pick up hermeneutical resources that way. What is more is that the movie might be aimed at children, but there are jokes and themes for adults in classic Pixar fashion. Children grow up to be adults, but that doesn't mean that adults can't also gain hermeneutical resources from these movies. The difference is that children search for resources more readily as they grow up, and emotional hermeneutical resources may be kept from them because of the fact that they lack autonomy in their lives, which is the injustice I was referring to earlier. But I watched both movies as an adult, and I remember seeing Riley's console start to turn black as she shut down. She couldn't feel any more emotion. The term depression wasn't mentioned, but as an adult, I understood this because I had felt exactly like this. And now I had a visual representation of an emotional state that I have gone through, which was very beneficial to me. But it also allowed me to describe this very complex emotional state to others, including children. And that is huge. Now, I want to be clear that the movie is definitely simplified and streamlined in how the brain and emotions work, but it is still accurate for what it is, and it is a source of transferring resources, both verbal and visual, to its audience. Now, someone out there might say, well, children are too young and need to be protected, and you shouldn't be talking about things like depression with them. But in keeping that knowledge and information away from children, we run the risk of creating a hermeneutical lacuna, or a lack of resource with which a child can describe how they feel. Of course, there is always an appropriate time and place for those discussions, but that is exactly what these movies get right. The resources are offered up within the narrative that doesn't overload the viewer, and as audiences grow up, they can return to and get more insight from watching again. And if you're lucky enough to grow up with these movies, then you might see the second or even future sequels reflect your own life experiences. With Inside Out 2's release, I hope parents take the time to take their children to see this movie and the first one, and talk with them about emotions, hopefully giving children the resources to express themselves and the space to do so in a healthy manner. Or perhaps as an adult, they will go watch these movies and will pick up some resources for themselves in order to be able to put words to their experiences or describe them to other people. This is really where I think the power of these two movies lies. While the narrative and characters are funny, compelling, and inspirational, and the world is both fun and scientific, it is because the movie also includes a basis in neuroscience and research on our emotions, and other psychological phenomenon too, that it is able to provide more than just a compelling story. It is able to reveal and provide hermeneutical resources to children who may be actively searching for them, and adults who may have repressed them. Without words or resources, we struggle to express our own experiences and connect to others. But maybe because of this movie, we can have a real conversation about emotions, because at the end of the day, all we can really do is strive to be the best versions of ourselves and attempt to help others do the same through empathy. And that is why I think the Inside Out movies have a powerful emotional impact that goes beyond the narrative. Here are my stray thoughts. There's a whole branch of philosophy on emotions that I'm not terribly familiar with, and I wanted to focus on hermeneutical resources, but if enough people are interested, I could look at doing a part 2 for perhaps another piece of media. Despite the fact that I think the first movie was smarter and more impactful, I liked the second movie better because of Riley's autonomy. Also, Bing Bong freaks me the fuck out. But the second movie does make cracks at my educational background.
Oh, ethnomusicologist!
I don't understand what that is.
Yeah, fuck you, Disney. Hey! Thanks so much for watching that video. If you enjoyed it, make sure you give that like button a hit right in the feels. I do think it's interesting to note that there was sort of a subtle hint at Riley maybe being homo or bisexual, but we'll see how that plays out. We all know Disney is a bit reluctant, to say the least, about having any main character even closely related to that topic. Just look at what they did to the Owl House. If you enjoyed this video, thank you so much for sticking around, because I got lots more ideas coming down the pipe right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.